Okay, we are live. We're going to give it a minute for people to filter in. Thank you for all of you who are tuning in. This is a reporters roundtable with the Charlotte Ledger. Going to give it a few more seconds. I know it's the Friday before the holiday weekend, so we'll see how many people are tuned in at 2:00 on a Friday before what for many people is a long weekend, but not everybody. All right, we will go ahead and get started. I'm Tony Mecia with the Charlotte Ledger. I'm joined by Ashley Fahey and Lindsey Banks from our team. We like to get together on these video chats every couple of weeks to let you know some of the stories we've been working on at the Charlotte Ledger. Talk a little bit about them, have a little bit of a conversation. You are welcome to join that conversation. We can put a comment in there, put in a message, and we can answer your questions. A lot going on this week. This is the first Reporters Roundtable that we've done in 2026. Look forward to doing many more. I think people like them. I hope people like them, and give us your feedback if you've got any feedback. But it was a pretty busy week, like I say, with things going on. One of the biggest stories I think that we had this week was the news about the site of the Manor Theater being redeveloped. This is one that a lot of people had been watching for a long time, as we sort of saw a lot of those. This is on that stretch of Providence Road in Eastover. Everybody knows the Manor Theater, of course, but over the last several months and years, some of those other buildings and businesses had been emptying out. There was the Panera next door that I think it was about 6 or 8 months ago. That went dark. You had the news of Laurel Market earlier in the week, switching locations. Ashley, why don't you talk a little bit about that? You broke that story on Wednesday when it came out. What's the significance of that Manor Theater site? Why is that such a big deal?
Yeah, I think it's a site, Tony, a lot of people know because of the Regal Manor Twin Theater that was there for 73 years. I know I'm not, I've only been in Charlotte for about a decade, and even I have memories there. So when that closed, I think a lot of people were just really curious about what would happen there. To your point earlier, it's a very prominent stretch of Providence. It's not far from Uptown. It's kind of a connector road between South Charlotte and Uptown. Very high traffic kind of corridor. And there's just been a lot of questions, what's going to happen here. So basically, this week, the owner of the property, which is Eastern Federal Corp, they've owned the property since inception back in the 40s. They and Dallas-based Streetlights Residential are planning to redevelop the site. They are going to do between 120 and 130 residential units. That will be a mix of for rent and for sale, is anticipated. And about 35,000 square feet of ground floor retail space. To compare, there's about 3,000 total on the site today, and that includes the kind of primary shopping center with the former Manor Theater, as well as the site with the Starbucks, the Laurel Market, and the Hilliard Studio Method, kind of on the side toward Fenton Place. So the site is bounded by Providence, Cherokee Road, and Fenton Place. And so the part of the site that's getting rezoned, they filed a rezoning petition. It's kind of in the back part of the site. It basically is just to allow the developer to do the project they want to do, which is going to be, again, kind of that mixed use residential retail space, maximum height of 80 feet. This won't be a site, Tony, we're going to see kind of redeveloped overnight. They still have to go through the rezoning process. They're going to have to engage with the neighborhood. Charlotte City Council will have to have a hearing for the project, and then at a later meeting, they'll make a decision on the rezoning. So the developers tell me that sometime in 2027 they'd like to break ground, but of course, a lot still just depends on what happens with the rezoning and any changes that are going to happen on the site.
Yeah, those rezonings, a lot of times they take longer than you think, and people always want to say, "Oh, well, this has been announced," and then 2 years later, still nothing's happened on the site, and it's not necessarily for lack of will, but the process tends to play out longer than a lot of people think, right? You've seen that in covering development over the years?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think people, they hear an announcement, they think like, oh, a shovel will be in the ground the next week. But there's a lot of things that go on behind the scenes. The entitlement, if there needs to be a land transaction, financing takes its own kind of several month process sometimes to secure. So, but it's a very high profile site. I think whatever's going to be built there, they want to do steel and concrete, not wood framed, which is a lot of the apartment kind of buildings we've seen in Charlotte and those Texas donut style 5-story projects. I don't get the impression that's what they're trying to do here. So I'm curious to learn more as we kind of get through the process. We'll be definitely interested to know how the neighborhood is going to react to it. Something I will be kind of looking into next week. So, but yeah, Tony, it's a big deal. I know you and I have probably individually been tracking this for years now, and it's interesting that we finally have some.
It is kind of funny because obviously, when you were at the Business Journal, you were asking about this, and when I've been with the Ledger, I've been asking about it, ever since basically it went dark. And I would check in with those Eastern Federal folks maybe every 6 months. What's new? Everybody else wants to know what's new. When's it going to be redeveloped? And these things sort of have their own time, and developers don't like to announce things really before they have their ducks in a row or the financing. And so it was sort of funny to see how that all evolved. I know you and I have each been watching that. It's one of the more high prominent, the more prominent places that people have been watching for sure.
Yeah.
Another piece that we had this week, Lindsay, you wrote about changes in the workplace. I know you talked to someone from Catapult, which is an employers association that tracks a lot of changes and things that are going on, gives advice to companies. What were some of the highlights?
Yeah, I mean, this is a story I think we like to do every year, just kind of keeping a finger on the pulse of what's going on as far as hiring and retainment. And, when the Ledger first got on the scene, the COVID was the big thing, obviously. So remote work and then AI last year, I remember that being obviously a big thing that was kind of shifting, um, roles and, how people were recruiting. And AI is still a big thing this year. And so I spoke to Doug Blizzard of Catapult. He's the chief solutions officer. And one thing that we talked about was AI. It's kind of hard to avoid that topic. And I think originally when AI entered the scene, it was replacing those entry level jobs that, maybe some jobs that had a lot of roles that could be automated by AI. And it originally was kind of under the idea that it would save companies money if they could just, subscribe to a AI software as opposed to paying a salary to an employee. And one thing we talked about this year is that, I mean, while that's still happening, that's not one of the main, or it still is one of the main reasons, but there's another reason why people are kind of adopting more AI and automation, and it's because of the lack of talent in the talent pool or, the hiring pool, and how there just aren't as many young workers entering the workforce that have the required skills to replace all the people that are retiring. And because of that, a lot of businesses are having to resort to AI. So that was a big thing. And then another thing that we talked about too is how skills based hiring is starting to become a really big thing, meaning some companies are looking more at, certifications, experience, whether or not you can do the job versus having the degree to back it up. Not to say that college still isn't, valuable and people, not to say that people still aren't going to college, but he's just noticed it's not as much of a priority, which has a lot to do, I think, with the amount of people entering the workforce and the talent pool. And because, maybe there aren't enough qualified on paper candidates, they're starting to kind of look into those other ways. And skilled hiring is another thing. So those were kind of the main things that we talked about. Obviously, too, immigration and tariffs. So the state of the economy has had some influence on, how companies are hiring as far as trying to save money. Also, with all the, immigration issues and border patrol, especially in the Charlotte area, coming into the area last year. And ICE is still very much has a presence, not just here, obviously, but across the country. It's kind of causing some, especially like in the retirement housing industry, which I kind of was surprised to learn that. But because of ICE and Border Patrol having a presence, some people are scared to show up to work, whether or not, they're here legally. Just the fear of being detained is keeping them home, and employers are having to find, other ways to have people show up and do the work. So that was another thing that we talked about. But I would say those are kind of the main trends that we're seeing. Nothing like super crazy surprising, but it's still good to check in and see where the industries are, at with their hiring and retainment.
Yeah, one of the things I think is interesting is, you see the pendulum starting to swing back a little bit more hiring nationally. I know has slowed down and coming out of COVID, people were jumping ship a lot to different, moving around. They had a lot of different options. A lot of company didn't, you could live anywhere, you could work from home. That's really kind of shifted back now a little bit. And yeah, you had that phenomenon that was a job hugging, I think, where people are staying in their
Oh, right.
jobs a little bit
Yes.
longer.
Yes, that's another trend that's been kind of dubbed job hugging. Yes, where people are um, a little fearful that there aren't as many, especially with AI taking away a lot of those entry level jobs, that there aren't as many opportunities um, to look elsewhere. And so, yeah, kind of like you were saying in COVID, there's a lot of job hopping because there was a lot of opportunity out there. And so now people are holding on and they're staying in their jobs longer because they don't know if they're going to be able to get a job elsewhere.
Well, we do want to take your questions. If you have questions, go ahead, drop them in the messages. I see one. I think getting back to Ashley, what you were talking about the Manor Theater. The question from Doyle says, "I'm encouraged by this project. Will it happen? Many Charlotte projects get zoning approval but never get built."
Yeah, I mean, that's anyone's guess, I think, but I think the intention is for it to get redeveloped. Obviously, a lot hinges on the economy and, if there's demand for the kind of housing they want to build. 35,000 square feet of retail is not a big amount, but it's a fairly substantial amount, and a developer needs to feel reasonably confident they can lease that space. So, it's still kind of anyone's guess, but the fact that they're going through the rezoning is definitely, I think, a signal that they're serious about whatever they're planning there.
Good deal. I see another question says, "Where are my pepperoni balls?" And it's a buddy of mine. I have a guys' weekend this weekend up in the mountains, and I'm usually in charge of cooking the pepperoni ball appetizer. So after this call, I will be driving up there and making some pepperoni balls for the
I
guys. If anybody was wondering what that question was,
I was glad you answered that question, Tony, because
yeah, I know it's a question I never. What one that I wrote this morning about Lending Tree. I had an interview on Wednesday with Lending Tree's new CEO, Scott Perry. Um, Talked to him for a half hour. We released it as a podcast yesterday afternoon. If anybody wants to take a listen to that, really interesting. He talked about the transition. Obviously, Lending Tree's former CEO, Doug Lebda, died in a utility vehicle wreck in October, and Perry was telling me about sort of how he got the news. He was watching a Seattle Mariners game. He lives in Seattle, watching a baseball playoff game. His phone kept ringing. He didn't answer because he was watching the game. I think a lot of us can relate to that. But he said, well, it kept ringing. It must be something serious. He picked up the phone, got the news, and obviously, his job changed a lot. Got that very quick, battlefield promotion to CEO, had to come in, steady the ship, and is now, in charge of a publicly traded company with 1,000 employees, maybe 600, 650 or so, I think, in Charlotte. And he said he thinks the future of the company is bright. I know, Lindsey, you mentioned AI. They're looking into AI and how do they improve the customer experience of shopping for mortgages, shopping for insurance, shopping for loans. And he said he's still very committed to Charlotte. I think that's been one of the questions. You have a CEO who lives on the West Coast, but the company is based in Charlotte. What happens with that? He said he foresees hiring in Charlotte, continuing to hire in Charlotte. It's been a good base, and no changes in the offing for Lending Tree, but certainly very interesting. The other sort of chilling tidbit was he also mentioned that a week before Lebda's death, he had a meeting with Doug Lebda and the head of HR and the board in which they reaffirmed the succession plan, and just to make sure if anything happened to Lebda, that it was that it was set in motion what would happen. And then obviously tragically and suddenly and shockingly, they had to put that into action just the next week. So it was a really interesting interview. He was a very down to earth guy, West Coast tech kind of guy, 48 years old. And so you can listen to that podcast on the Charlotte Ledger podcast, and we had it this morning in our newsletter as well. So very interesting, I thought. Ashley, you had a piece this week, also today, about these historic neighborhoods in Charlotte and how they're, well, I guess they're soon to be historic. Well, I think they have a historic designation. A couple of neighborhoods on the west side. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that and what it might mean for the I-77 toll project?
Yeah, so McCrory Heights and Oaklawn Park for years now, before we knew about the plans that were kind of released last year from NCDOT on I-77 South, they've been seeking National Register of Historic Places designation. Now, a lot of this kind of historic place stuff is honorific in nature, but interestingly, if you get listed on this register, there's some benefits that come with it, including you can be eligible for state and federal incentives to rehab your home, which a lot of the homes, of course, being a historic neighborhood, are old and maybe need HVAC, maybe need a new roof. So residents would be able to be eligible for this state and federal kind of tax incentives to help with that. But more interestingly, with the I-77 plans, which have been very controversial with the West Side, if you're listed on the National Register of Historic Places, that requires any agency that's coming in and doing a project that's federal, and of course with 77 being a federal highway, being an interstate, it would apply. So basically the section 106 review would kick in, and basically the point of that is for the agency to go in and do a review to make sure that they are not impacting these historic structures or historic neighborhoods. One of the biggest sticking points with the West Side in the plans that have been released is that we're going to lose some of our homes. I spoke with the president of the McCrory Heights Neighborhood Association, and a ramp is kind of currently scheduled to come through their neighborhood. It could take out about 8 homes. So of course they're concerned, and they say this isn't the first time. This is the third time that McCrory Heights has been impacted by a highway project. So it's basically another tool. It doesn't necessarily mean that NCDOT is going to have to completely rethink their project. And there's a little bit of a time element on this too, because NCDOT wants to get their get their plans squared away for this project by the summer. And we're still going. They're still going through the process to get the National Register of Historic Places designation. This week, the city's Historic District Commission voted unanimously to recommend the nomination for further review. It goes to the state next month, and then the federal government then has to decide they are designated. So it's just very interesting. It's one of those kinds of stories where it's really hard to say exactly what will happen. But we know that these plans have been very controversial with the West Side. I know, Lindsey, you've reported on this extensively. There's a lot of concern about public amenities like Fraser Park going away, or the cemetery that's in that area, people's homes getting destroyed. And even if certain things don't get impacted directly, there's still the idea that this highway is encroaching on their neighborhood. Noise, air pollution. The guy I spoke with, Sean Langley from the McCrory Heights Neighborhood Association, said there's a lot of schools like right on the highway there, and they're concerned about car emissions from an elevated highway potentially. I did speak with a highway division engineer with NCDOT this week. He did tell me that they are not seriously considering burying the project, which I know was talked about. That's something the neighborhood is very in support of. A lot of the neighborhoods want to see I-77 go underground, but because of the cost and the logistics associated with that, it's not being seriously studied at this time. So anyway, there's a lot of kind of moving parts to this, but I do think it's really interesting to see, the different ways these neighborhoods are trying to think of how to mitigate some of the impacts from this big infrastructure project, which is coming. And NCDOT has said many times plans are still preliminary. A lot could still change, but I think there's just a lot of concern, and I think there's just a lot of worries on the West Side about this is a story we keep seeing over and over again.
Yeah, I mean, this has been on the books for a long time, the widening of I-77, and they decided a couple years ago going to add some toll lane. I think they call them express lanes. In addition to the lanes that already exist, and it just becomes a problem of space. Like, how do you do that? Can you build them up? Can you build them below? At some point, something has to give there. And I don't know how that's going to be resolved. This is, I think, one of the biggest projects in NCDOT history because of the cost. They have to replace, what is it, a dozen bridges or something like that. I mean, that gets very expensive. This is going to be a long project once it gets approved, and it's going to be a lot of. I mean, if you think the traffic on I-77 South is bad now, wait until they start doing construction there. I mean, I'm guessing a lot of it will be middle of the night, but that's going to be kind of a mess, I think.
Yeah.
It's going.
the engineer just said, I'll just say this real quick. He said, this is one of the most complex and most expensive projects in NCDOT history. It's a very tight corridor. And as a reminder for those who may not know all the details, it's 11 miles from like around the Brookshire Freeway all the way to the South Carolina line. So, and then the engineer told me many times there's a lot of lessons learned from I-77 North project, which I know was very controversial with folks. But we'll just have to see. There's still a lot of questions here.
Yep. Another story that we followed this week, I attended a news conference on Tuesday at Elon University's building in South End. It was hyped. They put out the way these things work is they put out a press advisory a few days before. It was important, something like important changes to postgraduate studies in Charlotte or something like that. The news, of course, was that Elon would be asking the American Bar Association for permission to open a law school at Queens University of Charlotte in the Myers Park neighborhood. You might recall that Queens and Elon are in the process of merging, of combining forces. There are a lot of questions about what exactly that's going to look like, and what programs are where. What does it mean for students? What does it mean for athletics? What does it mean for staffing and employees and faculty? Not a lot of answers yet on really very many of those, but they did say they want to start a law school in Charlotte on the Queens campus. It would start initially with 75 students in 2027 and then grow by about 25 students per class until they get up to maybe 150, 175. It's a 2.5-year program. The tuition all in for those 2.5 years is $136,000, which they said is actually less expensive than a lot of their competitors. I talked to the dean of Elon Law, said that it's really important for Charlotte to have a law school where they can really engage in the community, produce lawyers that are working in a variety of legal fields, whether it's, large firms or nonprofits or community type of organizations, that really being here and having that presence and having that not the residential experience, but having that campus feel, with a gym and a cafeteria, that's something that's important to them. Elon currently has what they call a flex program, which is a part-time program, which I believe is 4 years. This would put the first full-time law school in Charlotte since Charlotte School of Law closed in 2017 under, shall we say, less than desirable circumstances. But this is, they do see a need for it. And so that's something they're going forward with. I know that Ashley, as an Elon grad, has tapped out of covering the story because of her allegiances to Elon, wouldn't want any favorable Elon coverage in the Ledger. See a question here from JG. Have they said yet what will happen to Queen's sports teams? I.e., will Elon teams just absorb them? They are saying right now, it sounds like they're going to keep them separate, and they will both continue to have them. Now, whether that exists and continues long term, I think remains to be seen. But they've said that the intention, I think, is to keep them separate, is my understanding. Either of you have any insights on that?
Not at all.
Okay, I believe that's the last on that. Let's see. We're just about out of time. We'll go around the horn. Any of you want to talk about other stories you were watching this week?
Yeah, I know a big one. We didn't get a chance to cover it, but I know a big one a lot of people were really paying attention to this week was a group of Buddhist monks came through the whole Charlotte region this week, starting kind of in the Fort Mill area. Then they made a stop at Ann Springs Close Greenway, and then the next day they were at Marion Deal Recreation Center in South Charlotte. Walked through. I know like droves and droves of people attended that. This has really become a big viral sensation. They're walking from Texas to Washington, D.C. on a 2,300-mile kind of walk. They're calling it a walk for peace. They're not really, quote unquote, protesting anything. It's just what they say on their Facebook page is to raise awareness of peace, loving kindness, and compassion across America and the world. I know a lot of people in my orbit, wanted to go and see them and even just stand alongside the road as they walk by. It's really a symbolic thing, but it's really been kind of amazing to see how many people have come out to listen to them speak. I know one of my good friends wanted to see Fort Mill, and she said the traffic around Ann Springs Close was pretty crazy. But yeah, it's kind of a cool thing to see. It's just not something you see every day here in Charlotte.
Lindsay, anything you were watching this week?
Yeah, not necessarily a news story, but I do want to plug the Ledger's Topman on the Arts newsletter, which is our arts coverage. We have Lawrence Topman. He's a longtime arts critic in the Charlotte area, and he writes about maybe once a week for us, reviewing just things around town. And so this week he went to the Mint Museum Uptown and reviewed an exhibit called Renaissance Romanticism and Rebellion. A little bit of a tongue twister. And it's just a collection of 70 European paintings and just pieces of art. And I won't get too much into his review, but I'm a little bit biased because I do work with him. But I just really think that his writing, he's so clever and smart and really insightful. And I think that newsletter is one of the many perks of being a Ledger subscriber. So if you're not already subscribed to that newsletter in particular, I highly recommend. But next week, he's going to be reviewing Spam-A-Lot, the stage production. So we have that to look forward to.
That'll be fun. And also in terms of plugging other Ledger newsletters, we had a special off-season edition of Football Friday today, in which Carol Walton looked at some of the different signings and some of the different players and recovering from injury, and also the signing of Luca De La Torre, who's a U.S. men's national team player. He was introduced to the media this week. So she's got all that coverage in Football Friday. You can also sign up for that. You can find that at thecharlotteledger.com. Ashley, any plugs?
I mean, I had a pretty good Ways of Life this week, which is our weekly obituary newsletters. I don't know how to say her name exactly. Jeanette Carpa, I think. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, but she unfortunately passed away at 44 from cancer, which is really sad. But she had just such a very vivid and cool, exciting life. She was described as the most extroverted extrovert and larger than life by those who knew her. And Caroline Willingham, who wrote this piece, did a great job of characterizing this woman's personality and everything she brought. She had roots in Liberia and went there recently, right before I think she passed. And that was really important for her to go and go back to kind of her roots and things like that. So, I'm not someone who knows a whole lot about obituary writing, but I always admire those who can do it really well. And I think, Ways of Life is one of those products where you can learn a lot about someone you may not have ever heard about. They're not the most renowned or famous people necessarily, but there's always kind of an interesting story to kind of hear about. So that came out Tuesday this week.
Well, good deal. Also, a couple fun things this week. We had a piece on if you're bummed out that the Panthers are out of the NFL playoffs, and if you're bummed out that Taylor Swift's fiance's team, the Kansas City Chiefs, is not in the playoffs. And I see Lindsay smiling as a big Swiftie. There is a suggestion for who you might want to follow. Drake May, who is a Myers Park High grad and a UNC grad, is lighting it up for the New England Patriots. And then also his wife, Ann Michael May, who's from Huntersville. They've met and been dating for a while, got married in June. She is getting some attention in the national media for her baking TikTok, and was mentioned many times in the New York Post and the Boston media market. So if you're just sort of following the playoffs for their cultural significance, you might want to tune into that part of it as well. And then also I want to give a shout out to, we have in our newsletter every day, we have a main headline, and then we have what we call internally the plus field, which is the part underneath the main headline in your email, where it hypes a few different things that are in that day's newsletter. And there was one today that said, Stamos spotted. What was that, Lindsay?
I'm very proud that I was able to condense that to 2 words, but John Stamos was spotted walking around the Lake Norman area in, I think, downtown Mooresville, to be more specific. But apparently he's in town. They're filming season 2 of The Hunting Wives, which I actually think we've talked about on these lives before.
Maybe make this into a Hunting Wives call, and we can talk all about The Hunting Wives, which I've never seen and probably shouldn't.
It's a Netflix drama. Brittany Snow. I've actually seen Brittany Snow walking around Noda myself. So that was during season 1. But anyway, so John Stamos, he's from Full House, Uncle Jesse. It's probably where most people know him from. But yeah, he was just spotted, and I'm not super in tune on Hunting Wives updates, but I did not know he was in season 2. I don't think he's in season 1. I have watched it and I can't remember. So I feel like that might be a little bit of a spoiler. if we aren't supposed to know that he's in season 2. But
okay. Well, maybe we can edit that out. You can post this, but anyway. All right. Well, I think that's going to do it for today. We're just about out of time. Lindsey Banks and Ashley Fahey, thanks for joining me. I'm Tony Mecia with the Charlotte Ledger. You can check out all of our work at thecharlotteledger.com and appreciate it. Have a great weekend, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.